The little girl's hand was cold, too cold, and her breathing came in shallow gasps that made the monitors scream their warnings into the sterile hospital air. Amara stood beside the bed in her navy scrubs, her young face tight with concentration as she examined the child's pupils, checked her pulse, reviewed the charts that 100 other doctors had already studied, and found no answers in. Behind her, Sheikh Faisal Al-Kuwari stood with both hands pressed to his head, his traditional red checkered gutra slightly askew, his white kandura wrinkled from days of sleeping in hospital chairs, his eyes wild with the kind of desperation that comes when money means nothing because it cannot buy the one thing you need. His daughter Noor, only 7 years old, was dying, and no one could tell him why. And now, his last hope rested on this 22-year-old medical student who should not even have been in this room, who had no business being here, except that every other option had failed. Amara was not supposed to be treating patients at all. She was a fourth-year medical student at King Saud University. Brilliant, but still in training, usually relegated to observing and taking notes while real doctors made real decisions. She had grown up in Jeddah, the daughter of a Sudanese immigrant who cleaned hotels, and a father who had died when she was 6, leaving them with nothing but his insistence that education was the only inheritance that mattered. Amara had taken that lesson and run with it, studying until her eyes burned, memorizing textbooks while her mother scrubbed toilets, earning scholarships that got her into medical school despite every systemic barrier designed to keep people like her out. She had a photographic memory and an ability to see patterns that others missed, connections between symptoms that seemed unrelated, the kind of diagnostic intuition that made her professors uncomfortable because it was better than theirs. The case of Noor Al-Kuwari had become legendary in medical circles across the Gulf and beyond. 3 months ago, the child had been perfectly healthy, a vibrant girl who loved horses and painting and had her father wrapped around her little finger. Then came the headaches, the fatigue, the muscle weakness that progressed so rapidly that within 2 weeks she could barely walk. Her father had flown in specialists from Johns Hopkins, from the Mayo Clinic, from Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. They had run every test imaginable, scanned every part of her body, consulted with each other in expensive video conferences that produced elaborate differential diagnoses, but no actual answers. Autoimmune disorder, perhaps, or a rare genetic condition, or possibly a slow-growing tumor they could not locate, or maybe a novel pathogen, or conceivably a mitochondrial disease. The theories multiplied, but Noor kept declining, and now she was in the pediatric intensive care unit, her small body failing system by system, and the specialists had quietly started preparing the family for the worst. Amara had heard about the case in the hospital cafeteria, doctors discussing it in hushed tones, shaking their heads at the tragedy of it. A child with every resource in the world and still beyond saving. She had asked to see the files, purely out of academic interest, and her supervising resident had laughed and said sure, if she wanted to waste time on a case that had stumped the best minds in medicine. So Amara had spent 3 nights reading through thousands of pages of medical records, test results, consultation notes, imaging studies. And on the 3rd night, at 2 a.m. in the medical library, she had seen it, the thing everyone else had missed because they were looking in the wrong direction. Getting anyone to listen to her theory had been nearly impossible. She was a student, she was young, she was black and female, and had no credentials that would make senior physicians take her seriously. But she had been persistent, to the point of insubordination, cornering doctors in hallways, sending emails that were ignored, finally ambushing the head of pediatrics outside his office, and refusing to leave until he looked at the evidence she had compiled. He had been annoyed at first, then interested despite himself, then shocked as he realized what she was showing him. Within an hour, Amara was standing in front of Sheikh Faisal, explaining her theory while he stared at her with a mixture of hope and disbelief that was painful to witness. "Your daughter does not have any of the diseases they have been testing for," Amara said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I believe she has been poisoned, chronically poisoned over the past 4 months by heavy metal toxicity, specifically thallium. And the reason no one caught it is because they were not looking for it. Thallium poisoning mimics dozens of other conditions, and the standard toxicology screens do not test for it unless specifically requested. But if you look at the pattern of her symptoms, the way they have progressed, The fact that nothing else makes sense. It fits perfectly. She pulled out her tablet, showing him charts she had made, highlighting the telltale signs that had been there all along, invisible until you knew what to look for. Sheikh Faisal had looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language, his exhausted mind struggling to process this new information. Poisoned? He repeated. How is that possible? Who would poison my daughter? But even as he asked, Amara could see him thinking, calculating, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror as implications became clear. Someone in his household, someone with access to Noor's food or drinks, someone who wanted to hurt him through the person he loved most in the world. The political and business rivalries, the family feuds, the enemies he had made climbing to his position of wealth and power, suddenly all of it took on sinister new dimensions. The head of pediatrics had immediately ordered the specialized tests needed to confirm thallium poisoning, tests that took 18 hours to process because they had to be sent to a reference laboratory in Germany. During that wait, Sheikh Faisal had sat in his daughter's room, watching her deteriorate further, praying to Allah that this young medical student was right, and that right would come in time. Amara had stayed too, monitoring Noor's vitals, preparing the treatment protocol she would recommend if the tests came back positive, trying not to think about what would happen to her career if she was wrong, if she had given false hope to a desperate father and his dying child. When the results came back positive, showing thallium levels more than 50 times the normal range, the hospital erupted into controlled chaos. The treatment for thallium poisoning was complex and dangerous, requiring a specific antidote called Prussian blue that essentially trapped the metal ions and allowed them to be excreted. But the process took weeks, and there was no guarantee that Noor had not already suffered permanent organ damage. The medical team wanted to transfer her to a specialized toxicology center in Switzerland, but Amara had argued against it, insisting that moving her in her current fragile state could kill her, that treatment needed to start immediately, that she had researched every case study and protocol, and knew exactly what needed to be done. Sheikh Faisal, faced with a decision that could mean life or death for his daughter, had looked at this young woman who had seen what 100 experts had missed, and made a choice that shocked everyone. She stays here, he said firmly, and you, he pointed at Amara, you will oversee her treatment. The other doctors will assist you, but you are in charge. The senior physicians had protested loudly, citing regulations and liability, and the absurdity of putting a medical student in charge of such a critical case. But the sheikh had been immovable. His daughter was dying under their expertise, and this student had saved her life by seeing the truth. He would trust her to finish what she started. The next 3 weeks were the most intense of Amara's life. She practically lived in Noor's hospital room, administering the Prussian blue, monitoring for the 100 complications that could arise, adjusting dosages based on daily blood tests, managing the supportive care needed to keep Noor stable, while her body slowly purged the poison. There were crises, moments when it seemed like they would lose her, times when Amara had to make split-second decisions that more experienced doctors would have agonized over. But she had prepared for this, had studied every possible scenario, had contingency plans for contingencies, and slowly, impossibly, Noor began to improve. The color returned to her face first, subtle but unmistakable. Then her vital signs began to stabilize, the wild fluctuations settling into normal ranges. Her kidney function improved. Her liver enzymes dropped. The neurological symptoms that had been so terrifying started to reverse. By week 2, she was alert enough to recognize her father, and the sound of her whispering "Baba" made Sheikh Faisal break down completely, sobbing in a way that made the nurses turn away to give him privacy. By week 3, she was sitting up, asking for her stuffed animals, complaining about the hospital food, showing signs of the personality that her father had feared was lost forever. During those weeks, while the medical miracle unfolded, Sheikh Faisal had launched his own investigation into who had poisoned his daughter. The truth, when it emerged, was devastating. It had been his business partner's son, a man named Khalid, who had felt cheated out of inheritance and had decided to punish the sheikh by destroying what he valued most. The poison had been administered through a special imported juice that Noor loved, delivered weekly as a gift that no one had questioned. Khalid had underestimated 2 things: the resilience of a child's will to live, and the brilliance of a young medical student who refused to accept that some cases were unsolvable. He was arrested, confessed under questioning, and would spend the next 20 years in prison contemplating his evil. When Noor was finally discharged from the hospital 2 months after Amara's diagnosis, she was weak but alive, facing months of physical therapy but expected to make a full recovery. The day she left, Sheikh Faisal stood in the hospital lobby with his daughter holding his hand, looking at Amara with an expression of gratitude so profound it was almost painful. "You gave me back my daughter," he said simply. "You gave me back my life. I can never repay that debt, but I will spend the rest of my life trying." He handed her an envelope, and when Amara opened it later, she found a check for an amount that made her gasp. More money than her mother would earn in 20 years of cleaning hotels. But the money, while life-changing, was not the most important thing Sheikh Faisal offered. He also gave her something more valuable: his influence and his commitment to her future. He made calls to the university administration, ensuring that her unorthodox role in treating Noor would not result in disciplinary action, but would instead be recognized as the extraordinary achievement it was. He funded a full scholarship for the remainder of her medical education and her residency, removing the financial stress that had shadowed every day of her studies. He connected her with the top medical professionals in his network, opening doors that would have remained closed to someone of her background. And most importantly, he became an advocate for changing the systems that made it so difficult for talented people from disadvantaged backgrounds to enter medicine, funding programs, and scholarships in Noor's name that would help dozens of others like Amara. Amara finished medical school at the top of her class. Her case study of Noor's diagnosis and treatment published in international medical journals, her name becoming known in toxicology circles. She completed her residency in emergency medicine, drawn to the fast-paced environment where diagnostic skills could mean the difference between life and death, where there was no time for the prejudices and politics that infected other specialties. She became known for her ability to solve difficult cases, for seeing what others missed, for refusing to give up on patients that other doctors had written off. 10 years after saving Noor's life, Dr. Amara Hassan ran the toxicology department at one of the premier hospitals in the Gulf region, treating poisoning cases from across the Middle East and Africa. She had published 3 textbooks, trained hundreds of medical students and residents, and had a reputation as one of the most brilliant diagnostic minds of her generation. Her mother had retired from cleaning hotels, living comfortably in a house that Amara had bought for her, finally able to rest after decades of exhausting labor. And Amara herself, still young at 32, was already being discussed for major medical awards and positions at international institutions. But her most important relationship remained with Noor Al-Kuwari, who had grown into a thoughtful 17-year-old with plans to study medicine herself, inspired by the woman who had saved her life. They had dinner together once a month, Amara and Noor and Sheikh Faisal, an unlikely family bound together by shared trauma and triumph. Noor called Amara her big sister, and in many ways that was accurate, a mentorship and friendship that transcended the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting. Sheikh Faisal, older now and semi-retired, had found purpose in his philanthropic work, his brush with nearly losing his daughter having fundamentally changed his priorities and values. The story of the medical student who diagnosed what 100 experts had missed became somewhat famous, written about in newspapers and medical publications, used in medical schools as a case study about the importance of thorough differential diagnosis and thinking beyond the obvious. But those articles rarely captured the human element, the desperation and fear and eventual joy, the way that crisis had revealed character and created bonds that lasted. They did not mention how Amara still sometimes woke up from nightmares about Noor dying, or how Sheikh Faisal still felt guilt about the business rivalries that had made his daughter a target, or how Noor herself struggled with trust issues and anxiety that no amount of therapy had fully resolved. What the articles also did not capture was the broader impact of what had happened, the way that one moment of brilliance being recognized and rewarded had ripple effects that touched countless lives. The medical students from poor backgrounds who got opportunities because of the scholarships Sheikh Faisal funded, the patients who survived because Amara trained their doctors to think more creatively about diagnosis, the systemic changes that slowly began to open medicine to people who looked like Amara and came from where she came from. None of it erased the fundamental injustices and barriers that still existed. But it proved that excellence could not be contained by prejudice, that genius wore no uniform, and that sometimes the most important breakthroughs came from the people the system most wanted to overlook. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing, so this channel can reach more people like you. Now back to the story. Years later, when Amara was asked about that night in the medical library, when she had finally seen the pattern no one else had seen, when she had realized what was killing Noor Al-Kuwari, she would say it was just good medicine, just thorough analysis and a bit of luck. But that was false modesty, a way of deflecting attention from her own brilliance. What had really happened was that she had refused to accept that some questions had no answers, that some patients were beyond help. She had believed that truth was always there, waiting to be discovered, that careful observation and relentless logic could solve even the most mysterious cases. And she had been right. Not just about Noor, but about the fundamental principle that would guide her entire career. Every patient deserved someone who would not give up, who would see them as a puzzle to be solved rather than a lost cause to be mourned, who would bring their full intelligence and humanity to the challenge of healing. That was what she had given Noor, and what she continued to give every patient who came through her doors, and it was worth more than any amount of money or recognition could possibly measure.